Every story contains conflict. And what's interesting is to see how people try to resolve conflict. In chapter 15, we get two pictures of conflict. One of them is Paul and Barnabas. They show us how not to resolve conflict, as they have this heated row. There is shouting and red faces. Paul and Barnabas. Paul, the one who kept preaching and speaking about being of one mind and one heart. And Barnabas, Mr. Encourager, have this flaming row. But I love it how Luke keeps this story in the story of Acts. It's important to see that these characters are human. They make mistakes too. That actually, they show us how not to try and resolve conflict. The second story is of an international church council trying to resolve the big issue of the day. Is it important for all believers to be circumcised? You might think that's not a very interesting thing to try and resolve, but in first century Palestine, this was a big issue. It's interesting how culture dictates the things the church must wrestle with. This second conflict is resolved in a much better way. There is a sense of humility in the conversation as people try together to discern what God is saying. What is God's will in this moment? The church council begins as Pharisaic believers argue why it's very important to celebrate circumcision. They see it as being a key part of their heritage, their tradition, a thing that people have died to try and protect, a symbol of their identity. And they give their reasoning. And when you hear their reasoning, you can begin to understand how important it was to them. Next of all, Peter speaks. He shares the story of what happened with Cornelius, about how they had received the Spirit and the message of Jesus without being circumcised. Paul and Barnabas add into this discussion, and they share what they'd seen happening amongst different non-Jewish people groups. And then James speaks. He's heard the different opinions that have been presented. And he concludes this, that circumcision is no longer important, that the non-Jews do not have to get circumcised to accept the message of Jesus. Though he affirms this, he also makes a really important point, that the non-Jews should not cause unnecessary offence for the Jewish people by mocking their traditions, but should respect them. What he's doing really here is he's taking the gospel and he's pulling it separate from Jewish culture, whilst at the same time respecting Jewish culture. This is how conflict should be resolved. One of the challenges we have today as the church is to make sure we haven't shackled the gospel to our cultural norms, that we've actually stopped people from coming to know Jesus because of the culture we embody the gospel in. As we wrestle through these things, it's not about circumcision today, but perhaps there are other expectations that we put on people before they can come to faith. We need to tease these things out. Often there can be differences of opinions. And what's important here is that we resolve conflict with humility and a desire to see God's will being done.